In a dusty town where freedom was worth less than a sack of grain, the sun rose slowly over cracked wooden buildings and a dirt street thick with footprints and old regrets. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, smoke, and dried earth. It was the kind of place where hope was a rare commodity, and mercy even rarer. At the edge of the town square stood a rough-hewn wooden post, from which dangled a small, worn sign painted in faded black letters, "Only $1." Below the sign, a young Comanche woman stood shackled by iron cuffs, her wrists raw and bruised, but her eyes sharp and burning with something the townsfolk hadn't seen in a long time-defiance. Her name was Nita. Nita was only 17 summers old, but her hands told stories of a lifetime's worth of hardship. They had sewn clothes that kept her family warm through bitter winters and mended wounds that would have otherwise meant death on the plains. Those same hands had cooked meals that filled the stomachs of strangers and kin alike, meals richer than any the saloon chef dared dream to serve, but none of that mattered here. The crowd gathered, rough men and weary women who had long since forgotten what compassion felt like. They didn't see a girl with skills or a heart full of quiet strength. To them, Nita was nothing more than property, a prize to be bought and sold at dawn like a sack of potatoes or a stray horse. Whispers floated through the crowd. Some spoke of the wars that had taken her family, the treaties broken and promises made only to be forgotten. Others joked cruelly about how easily she could be replaced. How little $1 could buy nowadays. Nita lifted her chin, the sun catching in her dark hair and lighting up the fire in her eyes. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and clear. "I can cook," she said, her words slicing through the morning air. "I can sew. I can clean. I will be anything you need. I am not worthless." Her words were met with laughter, rough and mocking. But beneath the jeers was something else, something that looked a little like curiosity. A little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is she chained?" The woman didn't answer. She looked away, ashamed. Behind the scene, an old man with tired eyes and hands stained from years of work watched silently. He had been a friend to Nita's family before the wars tore everything apart. He knew what the townsfolk did not, that this girl was a keeper of stories, a bearer of traditions that belonged to a people fighting to survive. The clock's hands crept toward dawn, and the auction block loomed like a judge ready to pass sentence. Nita's thoughts drifted back to the nights spent beside the fire with her mother and grandmother, learning the songs and the stories of their people. She remembered the sunflowers that bloomed wild and golden in the fields beyond the town, the only place where she felt free. Freedom, she realized bitterly, was a memory now. But even chained, even bound by iron and fear, her spirit was unbroken. Just as the first pale light stretched across the horizon, a shadow fell over the crowd. A stranger, tall and worn by travel, stepped forward from the line of onlookers. His eyes were sharp, but kind. His hands rested not on a gun, but on the brim of his hat, which he tipped slightly. He didn't speak yet. He simply looked at Nita, and for the first time that morning, someone truly saw her. The auctioneer cleared his throat, ready to start the cruel business, but the stranger's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Hold on," he said. "There's more to this girl than any dollar can buy." The crowd murmured, some angry, some curious. Nita looked up, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. The stranger's words hung in the air, a promise that the dawn might bring something other than loss, because in that dusty town where freedom was cheap, sometimes all it took was one person to stand up and change everything. The stranger's voice echoed through the morning chill, steady and calm, but carrying the weight of something urgent and undeniable. "Hold on. There's more to this girl than any dollar can buy." The auctioneer's gavel hovered mid-air, eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. The crowd shifted uneasily, some murmuring in protest, others silent with surprise. The rough men who had been ready to shout for bids now glanced at the stranger. With suspicion. Who are you to speak for her? The auctioneer barked, voice rough as gravel. This is a town of rules, and rules say the highest bid wins. The stranger pushed his hat back, revealing a face weathered by long roads and countless battles. Eyes sharp like a hawk's. I'm someone who knows what it means to fight for freedom. And I know that no person should be sold like cattle. The crowd's murmur turned to grumbling. Sounds like trouble, one man muttered. We don't need no trouble here. But the stranger wasn't finished. I'll pay the price, he said slowly, the $1. But I'm not here to buy her to own her. I'm here to buy her freedom. The words hung heavy in the air, a challenge and a promise all at once. Nita's heart pounded, a mix of fear and hope swelling inside her chest. Freedom, was it really possible? Could someone in this forsaken town really stand against the tide of greed and cruelty? The auctioneer's eyes flicked to the single-dollar bill in the stranger's hand. It was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the dust and grime of the day. Well, if you're willing to pay, it's yours, the auctioneer said grudgingly. Banging the gavel with finality, the shackles clinked as they were unlocked, and Nita rubbed her wrists, feeling the rawness of the cold iron and the sudden, unfamiliar lightness of release. For a moment she hesitated, unsure if this was a dream or a new kind of nightmare. The stranger stepped closer and offered her a steady hand. My name's Elias, he said quietly. I'm not from here, but I know what it's like to be trapped in a world that doesn't see you as human. Nita took his hand, gripping it firmly. Thank you, she whispered. But why? Why help me? Elias looked out at the crowd, his eyes hardening. Because what's happening here is wrong. Because no one should be sold for $1. Because freedom is worth fighting for. The townsfolk watched in silence, a mixture of resentment and grudging respect flickering across their faces. As the sun climbed higher, Elias helped Nita down from the auction block. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the earth beneath her feet, not as a trap, but as a place where she might find a new path. Where will you go? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled faintly. Somewhere the wind still carries the stories of the old ways. Somewhere you can be more than just a price. Nita nodded slowly. Her thoughts drifted back to the sunflower fields, to the songs and stories her mother had taught her, to the land where her people had lived free before the world turned harsh and cruel. Will you teach me? She asked. Every step of the way, Elias promised Dot as they walked away from the square. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering about the stranger who had bought the girl's freedom. But in Nita's heart, a new fire was kindling, a fire that could not be chained or sold. She was no longer just a prize at an auction. She was a survivor, a daughter of a proud people, and now, a symbol of hope. The dusty town faded behind them as they moved toward the horizon, where the sun blazed bright and the open sky promised more than just survival. It promised a chance to reclaim what was lost. Freedom, Nita realized, was not just a word. It was a fight, and this was only the beginning. The sun beat down relentlessly as Nita and Elias stepped beyond the dusty edges of the town, leaving behind the fading shadows of the auction block and the whispers of the crowd. The wind swept across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the promise of change. Elias didn't speak much at first. His eyes scanned the horizon as if searching for something unseen, while Nita's mind raced with questions, doubts, and a flickering hope she dared not fully embrace. How far is this place you speak of? She finally asked, breaking the silence. Elias looked over his shoulder, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Far enough to forget the sound of chains. Far enough to find what's left of freedom in this world. Nita frowned. And if it's not there? Then we'll make it, he said simply. They moved steadily through the rugged landscape. The earth beneath their boots cracked and dry. For a while, the only sounds were the crunch of their steps and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. At night, Elias made camp beneath the stars, building a small fire that flickered against the darkness. The firelight revealed the sharp angles of his face and the tired lines, etched deep from years of hardship. You don't have to tell me your story, Nita said one night, breaking the quiet. But I want to know why you care so much about freedom. Elias stared into the flames, the orange glow reflecting in his eyes. I was once like you, trapped, sold, forgotten. But I escaped. Took me years to find my way back to something worth living for. Nita listened, her own scars aching with the weight of his words. You were sold? She asked softly. He nodded. By people who saw me as nothing more than a commodity. But I learned that the chains that bind the body can be broken. The chains that bind the soul, those take a lifetime. Nita swallowed hard, feeling the truth in his confession. Then you understand why I can't go back, she said, voice trembling. Not to that town, not to that life. Elias reached out and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. You won't have to. The days that followed were a test of endurance and trust. Elias taught Nita how to read the signs of the land where water might be hidden beneath the rocky soil, how to track animals, and when to hide from danger. But it wasn't just survival skills he offered. He shared stories of resistance, of communities that refused to bow to oppression, of people who fought back with nothing but courage and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the distant mountains, Elias spoke of a place called Red Willow, a small settlement where those who had escaped captivity gathered to rebuild their lives. A place where freedom wasn't just a dream, but a promise kept. Red Willow isn't far, Elias said, tracing a finger across a worn map. If we can make it there, you'll find others like you, others who fought to reclaim their dignity. Nita's heart quickened. The thought of a new home, a new family, stirred something deep inside her. But the road was dangerous, and she knew the town they'd left behind wouldn't let her go easily. One afternoon, as they rested near a quiet stream, Nita spotted dust. Clouds rising in the distance, the telltale sign of a posse riding fast. Elias, she whispered urgently, they're coming. He stood immediately, eyes sharp and calculating. They won't stop until they find you. Nita's hands clenched at her sides, fear and defiance battling inside her. We have to move. Now, Elias said, grabbing a satchel and helping Nita to her feet. The chase was brutal. The riders were relentless, their voices carrying threats across the open plains. But Elias led Nita through hidden trails and dense thickets, places where horses struggled and the pursuers faltered. At one point, a bullet whizzed past, kicking up dirt near Nita's foot. Her breath caught, but she didn't falter. You're stronger than you think, Elias said, steadying her as they paused behind a fallen tree. The night fell quickly, masking their movements as they pressed on under the cover of darkness. Finally, after hours of running, they reached a narrow ravine. Elias stopped and looked back, eyes fierce. This is it, he said. We can't outrun them forever, but we can hide and fight if we must. Nita nodded, drawing strength from his presence. I'm ready. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the two crouched low among the rocks, hearts pounding with fear and determination. Freedom was no longer just a distant hope. It was a battle to be won. And together, they would face whatever came next. The first rays of dawn spilled over the rugged landscape, casting long shadows across the rocky ravine where Nita and Elias hid. The sounds of the pursuers had faded with the night, but the danger still clung to the air like a heavy fog. The world was waking up, and with it came the relentless reality that the fight for freedom was far from over. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes scanning the horizon. "We've bought ourselves some time," he murmured. "But not much. We need to keep moving." Nita nodded, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. Yet beneath her weariness, a spark of hope burned brighter than ever. Red Willow wasn't just a place on a map, it was the promise of a new beginning. A chance to reclaim what had been stolen from her and countless others. The journey resumed with a cautious urgency, their footsteps light against the dusty earth as they navigated through narrow canyons and dense patches of sagebrush. Elias's knowledge of the land was their shield, guiding them away from well-worn trails and into hidden paths that only the wild seemed to remember. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape began to shift. The harsh, barren plains gave way to clusters of trees willows swaying gently by a shimmering river that cut through the valley like a silver thread. It was here, Elias said, that Red Willow had taken root. From a distance, Nita could see the outline of small cabins nestled among the trees, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The air was alive with the scent of wood smoke and fresh earth, a stark contrast to the acrid dust and fear that had filled the town she had left behind. As they drew closer, figures appeared, men, women, and children moving about their daily tasks with a quiet determination. Some paused to look, eyes wary but not hostile. As Elias and Nita approached, a tall woman stepped forward, her expression firm but welcoming. She was dressed in sturdy clothes patched from years of wear, and her dark hair was pulled back into a braid that swung over one shoulder. "Elias," she greeted with a nod, "you've brought her at last." "This is Nita," Elias said, his voice steady. "She's come a long way." The woman studied Nita for a moment before extending her hand. "I'm Kaya, one of the leaders here. Welcome to Red Willow." Nita grasped Kaya's hand, feeling a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't seen as a prize or a possession. Here, she was simply a person, a survivor seeking refuge. Kaya led them toward a modest cabin where Nita could rest. The walls were lined with handmade quilts and simple wooden furniture, but the warmth inside was unmistakable. Elias stayed by her side, though it was clear he was eager to speak with others in the settlement. Over the next days, Nita began to learn the rhythms of life in Red Willow. It wasn't perfect. There were hardships, the constant vigilance against outside threats, and the scars that each person carried, but it was real. It was freedom. She found herself drawn to the small garden tended by an elderly woman named Mary, whose hands were as worn as the stories she shared. "Every plant has a purpose," Mary told her one afternoon, handing her a handful of dried herbs. "Just like every person. Even those who've been broken can bloom again." Nita tended the soil, letting the earth ground her. It was a small act of healing, but one that spoke volumes to her battered spirit. One evening, Elias returned with news that stirred a mixture of hope and caution throughout the settlement. "We've learned that the men who hunted Nita are planning a larger raid," he said, addressing the gathered group. "They want to send a message that no one can escape." The room fell silent, the weight of the threat pressing down on them all. Kaya stepped forward. "We won't let fear dictate our lives. Red Willow stands because we fight for ourselves, for each other." Nita felt something ignite within her, a fierce determination that no chain, no auction block, no shadow of the past could ever extinguish. That night, as the settlement prepared defenses and shared whispered plans, Nita sat by the fire with Elias. "Why do you stay?" she asked quietly. "After everything you've been through, why fight so hard for this place?" Elias looked into the flames, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Because this is where hope lives. Because I believe that freedom isn't just a word. It's a life we build, piece by piece, together." Nita nodded, the truth of his words sinking deep. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. The shadows of her past would follow her, and the fight for freedom was never truly over. But here, among these people, she had found something worth fighting for. As dawn broke over Red Willow, painting the sky with streaks of gold and pink, Nita stood at the edge of the river. The water flowed steady and strong, a reminder that even the fiercest storms could be overcome. Her hands were no longer shackled, her spirit no longer captive. Freedom was hard-won, fragile, and precious, and she was ready to claim it on her own terms. The days in Red Willow passed with a rhythm unlike anything Nita had known before, a rhythm of cautious peace, hard work, and whispered hope. The settlement had become a refuge, a place where survival was a collective effort and freedom was a shared treasure. Yet, beneath the calm surface, the threat from the outside world simmered like a storm on the horizon. Nita had settled into her new life, learning to sew quilts alongside Kea, to cook hearty meals with Miri, and to tend the small garden that nourished both body and spirit. Each day she grew stronger, not just in body, but in heart. But the news Elias had brought weighed heavily on everyone. The men who had chased Nita from the auction block were not just cowards looking for easy prey. They were part of a larger force intent on crushing any flicker of rebellion. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the willow trees, casting long shadows over the settlement, Elias gathered the leaders around a rough-hewn table inside the meeting hall. His voice was low but urgent. "They're coming," he said plainly. "And they won't stop until Red Willow is burned to the ground." Kaya's face hardened with resolve. "Then we'll be ready. We've trained, we've prepared. We fight because we must." Nita listened quietly, her hands clenched in her lap. Fear twisted inside her like a knot, but beneath it was a fierce flame, one that refused to be snuffed out. Later that night, as the camp settled under a blanket of stars, Elias found Nita sitting by the fire, staring into the glowing embers. "You're scared," he said softly, settling beside her. Nita nodded. "I am, but I'm also ready. Ready to fight for this, our freedom." Elias smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. "Good, because freedom isn't given, it's taken." The next days were a whirlwind of preparation. Men sharpened rifles and loaded ammunition. Women and children gathered food supplies and strengthened barricades. The settlement was a hive of activity, every soul aware that the coming battle could change everything. Nita spent her time helping where she could, sewing bandages, cooking stew over the fire, and learning to shoot a rifle under Elias's watchful eye. Each lesson was a step into a new world, one where she was no longer a victim but a warrior. One afternoon, while practicing with the rifle, she caught sight of movement beyond the trees. A group of riders, Gus trailing behind them, approached. Fast, her heart pounded in her chest as she raised the weapon, ready for what was to come. But as the riders drew closer, it became clear they weren't the enemy. A messenger from a nearby settlement galloped into Red Willow, urgency written on his face. "The men attacking you have gathered more forces," the rider warned. "They're planning a full assault by dawn." The news spread quickly, and the Fey camp braced itself. That night, a tense silence settled over Red Willow. Families huddled together, whispered prayers mingling with the crackle of fires. Elias moved through the camp, his voice steady as he gave instructions and reassurances. Nita watched him, admiration growing with every command he gave, every life he touched. When dawn finally broke, the quiet was shattered by the distant thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire. The battle had begun. Nita's heart raced. As she took her place among the defenders, the rifle heavy but steady in her hands. The attackers surged forward, shadows against the rising sun. But the people of Red Willow stood firm. Gunshots echoed through the valley, the air thick with dust, and the cries of battle. Nita fired when she could, each shot a prayer for survival, for freedom, for the chance to build a life beyond chains and fear. Amid the chaos, she caught sight of Elias fighting with fierce determination, protecting those who could not defend themselves. Their eyes met briefly, a silent promise passing between them. They would survive this day, no matter the cost. Hours passed like an eternity, but the tide began to turn. The attackers faltered, their numbers dwindling in the face of unyielding resistance. By midday, the remaining enemies retreated, leaving behind a battered but unbroken red willow. The settlement had won, but at a cost. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended, Nita stood beside Elias, watching the horizon. "This is just the beginning," Elias said quietly. Nita nodded, her spirit unshaken. "Then we fight every day after." Freedom, she realized, was more than a destination. It was a daily battle, one she was now ready to face, head held high, heart fierce and unbreakable. The morning after the battle broke over Red Willow in a quiet, almost reverent light. The camp lay battered but unbroken, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. Broken branches and trampled earth marked the places where the fight had raged fiercely. The willow trees swayed gently, as if whispering solace to those who had survived. Nita stood near the edge of the settlement, her gaze tracing the horizon where the enemy had disappeared into the distance the night before. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still pulsed through her veins. She could still hear the sharp crack of rifles, the shouts of men, and the cries of pain. But now, the battle was over. Her eyes fell to the ground where a small wildflower had pushed through the dirt, a fragile symbol of life and hope amidst the destruction. As she turned, Elias was already approaching, his face worn with exhaustion but softened by a quiet relief. He carried a small satchel filled with herbs and bandages, the tools of healing more vital now than weapons. "You did well," he said, his voice low but steady. Nita shook her head. "We all did, but the cost, it's heavy." Elias nodded. "That it is, but every scar is proof we're still here, that we're still fighting." Together, they moved toward the center of the camp, where Miri and several others tended to the wounded. Nita stepped forward to help, her hand steady as she wrapped a deep cut on a man's arm, her voice calm and reassuring. For the first time since the auction block, she felt useful, not a prize to be bartered, but a person with skills and strength. Hours passed in a blur of care and whispered prayers. Wounded men and women lay on makeshift beds of blankets and straw, their faces pale but determined. The younger children helped where they could, bringing water and food, offering smiles that warmed even the coldest nights. One such child, a boy, no older than 10, approached Nita shyly, holding out a tattered doll. "For you?" he said softly. "So you won't forget there's still kindness." Nita smiled, taking the doll gently. "Thank you, little one." That night, as the camp settled beneath a sky bursting with stars, Nita found herself by the riverbank, the cool water soothing her weary hands. Elias joined her, carrying a small bundle of fresh herbs. "The battle may be over," he said, sitting beside her, "but the war for our freedom is just beginning." She looked at him, eyes reflecting the flickering moonlight. "I'm scared. I never thought I'd have to fight like this again." Elias reached out, covering her hand with his. "You're not alone. We're in this together." They sat in silence for a while, the river's steady murmur a balm to their restless minds. "Tell me about your past," Nita said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I want to understand who you are." Elias sighed deeply, his gaze distant. "I was taken from my home when I was just a boy. Sold, like cattle, passed from one owner to another. It was years before I escaped years of darkness and chains." He paused, swallowing hard. but I swore if I ever got free, I'd fight to make sure no one else had to live like that." Nita's heart ached at his words, recognizing in his story the same pain that had nearly crushed her spirit. Yet here he was strong, unyielding, and fighting for a future where children wouldn't know the taste of captivity. Over the next days, Nita grew into her new role in Red Willow. She helped mend clothes and cook meals, but she also trained with Elias and others in defense and survival. Every rifle shot, every whispered lesson in strategy, was a step toward reclaiming her agency. One afternoon, she and Kaya worked side by side repairing a fence when Kaya spoke quietly. "Red Willow is more than a refuge. It's a family. We fight not just for ourselves, but for each other." Nita looked up, feeling the weight of those words. This was a place where wounds could heal, where broken spirits could mend, and where hope, fragile but fierce, could grow. But even in the warmth of community, the threat outside remained. A scout returned one evening with troubling news. The enemy was regrouping, gathering strength for another attack. This time, it would be bigger, more brutal. The camp rallied, but fear crept like a shadow through the hearts of even the bravest. That night, as Nita lay beneath the stars, she thought of the auction block, the chains, and the men who had tried to steal her freedom. She thought of Elias, of Kaya, of the faces around the campfire. She wasn't the same girl who had stood shackled beneath that cruel sign. She was a fighter, a sister, a healer, a beacon, and when the next storm came, she would stand tall, ready to face it head on, because freedom wasn't just a place. It was the fire burning inside her soul. The days that followed the scouts' warning passed in a tense silence. Red Willow was no longer just a quiet refuge nestled among the willows. It had become a fortress of hope, a fragile bastion against the coming storm. Every face bore the weight of anticipation, the kind that settled deep into bones and nerves. Nita felt the unease like a low hum beneath her skin. She moved through the camp with purpose, helping patch clothes, sharpening rifles, boiling water for the wounded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, always drifting toward the inevitable battle looming on the horizon. Elias had taken charge of the defenses, drilling the men and women tirelessly. His voice, calm and commanding, cut through the growing tension like a blade. "Stay sharp. Trust your instincts. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every soul who's ever been chained, silenced, or sold." Nita watched him from the corner of her eye, admiration mixed with a growing feeling she struggled to name. In him, she saw the fierce protector she longed for, the man who stood tall in the face of fear. That evening, as the sun bled red over the hills, Nita found herself by the campfire, stitching a quilt alongside Kaya and Miri. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on their faces. "Do you think we can hold them off?" Miri asked quietly, voice trembling. Kaya's hands never faltered as she sewed. "We have to. There's no other choice." Nita looked into the flames, feeling the heat on her skin but the cold knot of doubt in her chest. The settlement had faced death before. They had survived auctions, brutal men, and a savage battle. But this time felt different, larger, more dangerous. The enemy was no longer a scattered group of raiders. They were an army, hungry to crush any flicker of resistance. Night crept in thick and suffocating, but sleep eluded Nita. She walked to the edge of the camp, where the willow trees whispered secrets in the breeze. Her fingers traced the scars on her wrists, the marks left by chains that once bound her. The memory of the auction block, the cold glare of strangers bidding for her life, came rushing back like a bitter wind. But she was free now. Free because she had fought, because she had found a new family in this ragtag band of survivors. A soft voice broke the silence behind her. "You won't face this alone." Elias stepped into the moonlight, his presence steady and reassuring. He moved close, eyes searching hers. "I'm scared," Nita admitted, the vulnerability raw and real. "But I'm also ready." "I have to be," he nodded. "That's what makes you strong." They stood side by side, two warriors bound by shared pain and fierce hope. The following days were a blur of preparation. Trenches were dug, watchposts manned, and supplies rationed. Nita helped wherever she could, cooking, sewing, healing, but her heart was always on the lookout, always ready for the first sign of attack. The settlement became a hive of whispered plans and quiet prayers. On the morning of the day the enemy was expected to strike, the sky was an endless expanse of pale gray. The air was heavy, charged with a tension that made every breath feel shallow. Relo's defenders gathered, faces grim but determined. Elias stood before them, voice steady as a rock. "Today, we fight not just for Red Willow, but for every person who's ever been told they're less than human. We fight for our freedom, our families, and our future. Stand strong. Fight hard. And no matter what, never lose hope." The crowd's murmurs grew into a unified roar, a sound born from fear, courage, and unbreakable will. Nita gripped her rifle tightly, heart pounding in rhythm with the rising tension. She glanced at Elias, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. The first shadows appeared at the edge of the trees, figures silhouetted against the breaking dawn. The enemy had come, and there was no turning back. Gunfire shattered the morning calm. The battle erupted like a wildfire, fierce and unrelenting. Nita fired into the advancing horde, every shot a prayer, every breath a defiance. The ground shook beneath pounding hooves and desperate cries. Friends fell beside her, their faces etched with pain and determination. Yet through the chaos, the spirit of Red Willow burned bright, unyielding, and fierce. Amid the cacophony, Nita found Elias fighting with a relentless fire. Their eyes met across the battlefield, a silent promise. No matter what happened, they would face it together. Hours stretched like days, but the tide slowly turned. The enemy faltered, their ranks breaking under the unbreakable will of Red Willow's defenders. As the sun climbed high, the last of the attackers fled, leaving behind a battered but victorious settlement. Nita collapsed to her knees, breath ragged, body aching, but her spirit soared. They had won. For now, because freedom, she knew, was a battle fought every day, and she was ready to fight it, no matter the cost. The sun rose slowly over Red Willow, casting long golden rays through the willow trees and lighting the dust that still hung heavy in the air. The battle was over, but the scars it left ran deep, not just in the earth, but in the hearts of those who had fought for their lives, their freedom, and their future. Nita sat on a rough wooden bench outside one of the cabins, her hands resting on her knees, still trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around her, the settlement buzzed with quiet activity, wounded being tended, supplies being gathered, and whispered conversations filled with relief and determination. Elias approached, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes as steady as ever. He knelt beside her, offering a small, tired smile. "We held them off," he said simply. Nita nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We did, but at what cost?" She thought of those who would never see another dawn, the friends who had fallen in the fight, the families shattered, the promises made in blood. Elias reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "We honor them by living, by building something better." Nita looked up at him, the weight of his words settling like a balm over her soul. For the first time since she had been sold beneath that cruel sign, she felt something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. The days that followed were filled with both sorrow and hope. The survivors buried their dead with quiet reverence beneath the willow trees, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, and stories told, reminders that even in loss, Life endured. Nita found herself at the center of the settlement's rebirth. Her skills in sewing, cooking, and healing had grown beyond mere survival. They became acts of love and community. She taught others how to mend clothes and cook hearty meals, how to care for wounds both seen and unseen. Kea, now a trusted leader alongside Elias, often said, "Nita, you've become the heart of Red Willow." Nita smiled, humbled. We're all the heart together. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the earth and the willows whispered in the breeze, Elias found her by the river again, the same spot where they had shared their fears and hopes. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, worn leather pouch. Curious, Nita opened it to find a delicate silver necklace, an intricate charm shaped like a feather. "It belonged to my mother," Elias explained. "She gave it to me before I escaped. I want you to have it, as a symbol of strength and freedom." Tears filled Nita's eyes as she fastened the necklace around her neck. It was more than jewelry. It was a promise, a bond, and a new beginning. In the months that followed, Red Willow flourished. The settlement grew into a thriving community where people of all backgrounds found refuge and purpose. The willow trees that had witnessed so much pain now stood as symbols of resilience and renewal. Nita and Elias worked side by side, building a future neither had dared dream of before. They married beneath the sprawling branches of the oldest willow, surrounded by friends who had become family. Their vows were simple but profound, a promise to protect each other and their community, to stand against injustice, and to nurture the fragile flame of freedom. As the seasons turned, the shadows of the past grew fainter. The auctions that once sold human lives like cattle became distant memories, replaced by laughter, music, and the promise of tomorrow. Nita often thought back to that dusty auction block, the cold eyes of strangers and the chains that once bound her. She marveled at how far she had come from a girl desperate to survive to a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Nita stood beneath the willow trees, with Elias at her side. Together they watched children play in the fading light, free, joyful, and safe. "This is what I fought for," Nita whispered. Elias squeezed her hand. "And this is only the beginning," because in Red Willow they had learned that freedom was more than a word. It was a fire that could never be extinguished, a legacy to be passed down through generations. And no matter what storms came their way, they would face them as one, for they were no longer prisoners of the past. They were the architects of their own destiny, and the dawn belonged to them.